Welcome to the Norman Lowell interviews. This is our 7th podcast. The topic, race, nation and state. Norman, thank you very much for joining us, first of all. There is a lot of confusion in the minds of the common people regarding the concepts of race, nation and state. The three are indiscriminately used and abused, lumped together with no precise understanding of our true definition and delineation. Our enemies, the international rodents, as we call them, use this confusion for their own ends and, of course, muddy the waters still further in their pursuit of the destruction of races and peoples. Knowledge of the true meaning of the three concepts is therefore fundamental in our fight for survival. So how can you explain the racial part, race? I know we discussed this in podcast 1,
Yes.
But can you elaborate further, please?
You're right, Adriano. We discussed race quite extensively in our podcast number 1. We pointed out that skin color is the least important factor in determining the variability of races. Other factors are odor, shape of skull, facial features, size and shape of genitalia, blood groupings, and susceptibility to certain diseases. I suggest that interested listeners visit podcast number 1 for a more detailed exposition of the subject.
Okay, that leads us to the second part, nation. How do you describe nation?
Good question, Adrian. Nation is flesh and blood. It is people. It is common consciousness of an identity, a consciousness of a people's characteristics. Nation is language, culture, customs, religion. It is common perceptions, fears and phobias, a common identification of who is the common enemy or perceived friends. Nation is the knowledge of a common history and the common yearning for a common destiny. Now, a cat born in a stable is not a horse. Thus, a birth certificate does not make a Nigerian Negroid a German, a Frenchman, or a Maltese. Race determines everything. Nations are the various subdivisions of the race. Thus, in simple language, Germans, Frenchmen, British, the Swedes, and the Russians are all nations within the white race. Within these nations are further subdivisions. In Britain, there are the Scots, the Irish, and the Welsh. In Spain, the Catalonians, the Basques, and others. In France, the Bretons, the Germans, Italians, and the Cotillonneurs. There are the Tyrolese, the Ticini, Italian minorities in Istria, Dalmatia, and even in the Ukraine. The Balkans are a myriad of various sub-nations, all living cheek by jowl, mostly in animosity amongst themselves. A tragedy.
Well, Norman, many people confuse nation and state all the time. The meaning is completely separate. But how would you define state then?
Yes, state is the juridical setup of a nation. It is law, civil service, army, police, etc. State is a completely different entity from either race or nation. The USA government is a glaring example of a state representing neither the race nor the people. It is a government juridical system taken over, hijacked by a pernicious minority of aliens. The international rodents, through their hold on the state government apparatus, thus control all the various branches that make up the state. They can bamboozle the captive population, composed of the various nationalities and races that make up the USA and march them off to war whenever it suits their purpose, and more often than not, for the benefit of plutocratic corporations.
I see. So why is Imperium Europa so concerned about the difference between nation and state?
What a good question. That is why we have been divided for so long, us Europeans. Nation versus nation, state against state, sub-nation opposed to sub-nation, and other configuration of all these. A tragedy for the white race, a continuous fratricide, a spilling of precious blood of the small minority of biological aristocrats, spread so thinly among the billions of the third world. Not only that, but the breeding of these aliens within our midst, our heartlands, white women cohabiting with primitive blacks, a planetary dysgenic disaster.
Why is that?
Because our enemies cleverly interplay the three concepts: race, nation, state. They have confused us as to their real definition and delineation, to the point where blacks play football for Britain and Germany, represent France and Sweden at the Olympic Games, and so on. Yes, oh yes, our people are confused. Only the vision, the idea of Imperium Europa can save the white race. Only this unifying idea can solve the riddle of race, nation, state. An imperium acting as a state on a planetary scale, encapsulating the various nations and sub-nations of the white race. Nations and sub-nations, cousins living in harmony with each other, conscious of a common history and destiny. Ave.
Thank you, Norman. That brings us to the end of this podcast number 7. Thank you to all the listeners. Those who'd like to get in touch with us can do so by emailing info@imperium-europa.org. We kindly ask you to share this material. Ave.